This presentation, I really hope it can be kind of a venue for generating discussion, particularly discussion about methodologies, because these issues that were raised this morning, and I think that will be discussed in the later meetings, really kind of highlight our interest in moving ahead and trying to incorporate these concepts of assessing cumulative impacts into our studies and data analysis and ultimately into interventions. I changed the title of my talk a little bit from application of a cumulative impact framework to understand environmental exposures. I changed understand to think about. And that's to underscore the point that we really don't have, I think, a clear map on how to move forward on these issues, although I think one may emerge from meetings like this one. So just to summarize some of the things I'll go over today, I'm going to go back to the beginning of our study in Chamacos, where we were thinking about mixed exposures, we were thinking about cumulative impacts, and our first start with an attempt to look at these kind of issues, which was to do a risk assessment, looking at mixed exposures. Then I'll just highlight some of the other things we're looking at, and then I want to emphasize some of the social stressor information we're collecting, some of the challenges with that, and then try to put it into the OEHA framework and think about where we can go forward. This talk is not going to be that technical, but I think provide an overview of some of the challenges we have. First, I want to start with the definition of cumulative impacts that OEHA published in 2010. And generally, it's an admonition to consider exposures, different kinds of exposures, different chemicals, and their impact on our health and environment. So I'll be coming back to this as we go along, but I really want to highlight that report because I think it provides a good framework to think about cumulative impacts. Just a reminder, we've been working in the Salinas Valley in California, in Monterey County, for about 15 years now. This area lights up as a relatively high area of pesticide use in California, although not dissimilar from other agricultural areas. We were initially interested in pesticides, but certainly that wasn't the only focus of our work. This area is about 100 miles south of San Francisco. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. And we initiated a birth cohort study that looked at, started with pregnancy, and we're continuing to follow the kids through 12 years of age. So this is a long-term study. In general, the women in our study were low-income Mexican-American immigrants working in agriculture, or from a household that worked in agriculture, so at least someone in the household worked in agriculture, and relatively low education as well. We had about 550 kids born to our study. Some have dropped out. We enrolled another group of kids, so right now we have about 600 kids enrolled in our study. So relatively big sample size for a cohort study. Again, today's talk, I'm going to talk first about our cumulative risk assessment, just to give kind of a little background on our first take on these issues. One was that we were looking at exposures to organophosphate pesticides. Those were our first priority. And as you know, we have this kind of risk assessment paradigm from the National Research Council that really defines a lot of our approaches to risk assessment, even today. It's often chemical by chemical, and we take information about exposure and dose response and come up with some sort of risk characterization. In the late 90s and early 2000s, EPA wanted to advance this concept, which now seems primitive, but then seemed state of the art, which was to basically take mixed exposures to a group of chemicals that have a similar effect. We've heard some comments about that sort of risk assessment earlier, and here's just a quick, concrete example of that. They basically advised the risk assessment community out there to take information on exposure and then use relative potency factors to essentially aggregate all of the exposures into one pesticide equivalent. So just to provide a quick example, if we look at organophosphate urinary metabolite levels in the Chamacos population, you can see here the levels are pretty stable during pregnancy. They increase during childhood, but importantly, they're higher than this green column here, which are the levels in the NHANES reference data. So if we look at our population relative to US reference data, our exposures are higher. They're not 10 times higher, but there's certainly some evidence for higher exposure. And we wanted to take that evidence of exposure and convert it into a dose. So we had 6 non-specific urinary metabolites. They come from a mixture of organophosphates. We don't know which one they came from. we needed some way to attribute them to individual pesticides. So first, we used methods developed by Richard Fenske to estimate a total dose of either a dialkyl phosphate or a dimethyl or a diethyl OP. Then we used detailed information, which is unique in California, on pesticide use in California. And essentially, we're able to use that information and assign a likely exposure to each individual pesticide. You can see here we have a big mixture of compounds. There's a lot of differences in toxicity, but they all operate by the same mechanism. Then the guidelines recommend using the relative potency information to normalize the exposure. Just to give an example here, if we use chlorpyrifos, which had a no effect level of 0.03, if we use that as the reference, we can then compare other pesticides to that reference. For example, oxydemeton methyl is 2.3 times as toxic as chlorpyrifos. So if you got exposed to 1 unit of chlorpyrifos and 1 unit of oxydemeton methyl, you had approximately 3.3 units of chlorpyrifos equivalent exposure. So it was a way of essentially aggregating the exposures into a common term. So if you aggregate those exposures and then compare them to relative various benchmarks, in this case the benchmark dose with a 10% effect on brain cholinesterase inhibition, we find that with various safety factors that many women in our population would actually exceed some of those thresholds. So this was kind of an interesting intellectual effort to try to understand a mixed exposure, or at that time considered a cumulative exposure, and really combine different chemicals into one assessment of risk. Now, the kind of interesting piece with this is that as we've conducted our study, we have found fairly consistent relationships between those early exposures during pregnancy and a number of adverse health outcomes in children. I'm not going to go through them in detail, but we found effects on gestation, abnormal reflexes at birth, neurodevelopment at 2 years of age, behavior at 5 years of age, pervasive developmental disorder at 2 years of age, and more recently, IQ at 7 years of age. So at least there's some internal consistency across age points. We also found that our results were consistent with studies published from New York. So in general, there's kind of evidence here that that risk assessment approach made sense. There was some evidence of excess exposure, and we're seeing some relationship between health effects that I think if this goes on and gets validated, it's going to make us think differently about organophosphated pesticides. There's obviously a lot of caveats here, and I won't go into that now, but again, the model seemed to work. The next piece of the framework we get from OEHA is to, well, we're not doing it chemical by chemical, but the next step is thinking, well, we need to be looking at multiple exposures. And I just want to review some of those here just to get a sense of what we're doing. And I kind of hesitate to say, but we're kind of following the approach so far that Martin Smith mentioned earlier of looking at these on an individual basis. We know in California that children have high flame retardant exposures. The Chamacos kids are no exception. And we've seen a number of relationships between those flame retardant exposures and health outcomes in our study, both in terms of, in terms of 3 outcomes so far: lower TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone levels in the mothers during pregnancy, longer time to pregnancy for women who had higher exposures, and also effects on neurodevelopment at 7 years of age. Somewhat similar to what we saw for the organophosphates, but independent, at least statistically, of those effects. We also have higher DDT exposures in our population. The women in our population came from Mexico, and they have relatively higher DDT exposures because it was used more recently for malaria control. We've also seen some relationships between these exposures and neurodevelopmental effects in the children that, again, are independent statistically of the other relationships. We're also starting to look at other exposures, some of them related to pesticides, some of them not. But again, this kind of underscores just the plethora of things we're exposed to. And again, moving forward, I'm hoping that we can develop ways to deal with this. Just to summarize some of these things, we're looking at pyrethroid pesticides, manganese related to fungicide use, organophosphate flame retardants. We're developing a proposal to look at fumigants like chloropicrin and methyl bromide. All of these in red are likely to be higher in our exposures, higher in our population relative to other populations. We're also looking at other things too. And again, it just highlights there's a long list of things we're exposed to. So now I'm going to stop here and skip over to some of the information on social stressors that we're collecting. Just a reminder back to the OEHA framework, not only are we looking at exposures, we're also looking at sensitive populations and socioeconomic factors. And I just want to review some of those we've collected and then really lay out a framework or a set of topics that we can discuss going forward and later on in the afternoon. One, I think this summarizes many of the discussions we had today about the various factors that affect health and development in children. There's both individual factors like genes, genetics. We've heard a little bit about epigenetics today. And then there's the larger environment where we think about things like violence, discrimination, poverty. Some of these things determine risk, which is often what we're focused on. But I want to emphasize that some of these also determine resiliency. And I think that's something we need to think a little bit more about when we're doing these kinds of analyses and evaluations of cumulative impacts. Just to summarize some of the information from our study, there's very poor home environments in a lot of different levels. There are high rates of maternal depression, lots of crowding. These are off the chart in terms of crowding compared to national reference data, lots of pest infestations. In an agricultural area, we have food insecurity in this big food producing area, low social support, not great stimulation for the kids. No blocks or stacking toys in many of the homes, very few books in many homes, and lots of homes with deteriorated housing. These are all important factors. I want to kind of provide an image of some of these because I think these are important, especially the housing quality, mold, cockroach feces, lots of examples of poor environments, and then also poor physical neighborhood play environments. I think this picture is kind of iconic in terms of kids playing in front of a liquor store. In a parking lot, we've had 2 children in our studies killed from cars backing out of soft-story garages. So the environment matters. The built environment matters. To put these in a little bit more quantitative terms, when we look at our statistical analyses, I often think of these things as the covariates. These are the things we often control for in statistical analyses. And in our studies and in some others, these often come out as important for the outcomes we're looking at, like neurodevelopment. Home score, the home observation score, which is a measure of stimulation. Whether they attended preschool is very important. Family stability, with better family stability, there's better outcomes. Poverty status, poor children don't do as well. Parent education, social status, maternal depression, maternal stress is often a big factor in some studies, larger than effects related to pesticides. And then, of course, housing quality. Other things that we want to look at going forward that we're also collecting data on are neighborhood factors, walkability, parks or absence of parks, and also violence. Unfortunately, in the Salinas community, there's extremely high rates of violence. So there's a whole, again, plethora of factors, many of which we heard about earlier today. So I want to emphasize here that when we talk about these kinds of covariates and social factors that we're collecting, socioeconomic factors that we're collecting information on, it takes painstaking labor to collect this information. We heard a lot about the challenges related to laboratory analysis today and where that can go forward. To collect this kind of information on an individual basis in studies is extremely time-consuming. In some cases, you can use census-based data to get group-level information for some of these factors like poverty, et cetera. But on an individual basis, you often have to do the shoe leather epidemiology. I kind of want to make this point here. This is just a little comparison looking at sensitivity and specificity of the presence of mold in a house based on a questionnaire versus a home inspection, which we used as a gold standard. And in general, both mold and water damage. And in general, the questionnaire did not really perform well. The home inspection was necessary. So when we think about some of these social stressors, some we can collect by questionnaire. Things like maternal depression, family stability. But when we talk about the home score, in stimulation in the home, there's a questionnaire component and there's a home inspection component. When we start talking about housing quality and other factors that are also likely very important for child development and health, we often need to go on the ground and collect the information. And I just think that's a real challenge that we have to think about and how to operationalize collection of that information and standardize it for these the kinds of studies we're doing and the kinds of studies that are discussed and proposed in these kind of discussions. The next step I wanted to do was to take this information and put it in the framework of the OEHA 210 report, just to kind of get a sense of the magnitude of issues in our community. They propose a formula relating the cumulative impact as a function of exposures, public health effects, environmental effects, and then modified by sensitivity of populations and socioeconomic factors. And they have a potential range of scores to consider. Clearly, we have a lot of information for our Chamacos population, including exposure, public health effects, environmental effects. We have some data on sensitive populations. I didn't present that, but we've looked at genetic factors. And then we also have a lot of information on socioeconomic factors, both group and individual level. If you take that and apply the OEHA the framework, you basically get a population rank, at least in our population, of over 100, which is relatively high. So here we have, I think a priori, a population that we would likely identify as ranking high and of concern. And with a few assumptions, we kind of fit into that ranking scheme. If I look at West Monterey County, which is more affluent and has fewer economic challenges and also much fewer exposures in terms of proximity to agriculture and other sources, the ranking is much lower. So I think that this tool and this information is very valuable and useful for ranking and comparing populations between regions or within regions, but we're still kind of faced with these challenges for how to do assessments that we can use within populations and used in epidemiologic studies looking at mixed exposures. And by mixed exposures here, again, I mean both chemical, social, et cetera. So in terms of the next steps of where we're going, and this is where I hope we can have some discussion today, we do plan to go forward and try to look at ways to assess the impacts of mixed chemical exposures. Are there common pathways like oxidative stress that we can use to integrate the different chemical class exposures, but look at common outcomes? The next step, and I think this is kind of a challenge to the epidemiologists, I think we need to develop metrics to integrate socioeconomic factors, both at the home level and the neighborhood level, into useful metrics and scales that we can use for epidemiologic analyses. And I don't think we've done that. Things like depression scales, we have kind of a template for many of these factors, but I don't think we've yet taken it to the next step to incorporate these more meta-level factors like neighborhood quality. Again, to reiterate my point earlier, I think we need to spend more time looking at determinants of resiliency and how those should be considered in analyses. And then going forward, and at least in our group, I think there's a lot of reason to, as was discussed this morning, that we hope to go ahead and look at biomarkers and epigenetics, and I think we have an opportunity here to apply these concepts of the exposome to the Chamacos population. Then finally, I hope we can evaluate the interactions of these factors with chemical exposures on neurodevelopment and take that information to guide interventions and also guide how to encourage resiliency. So both preventing problems, but also how to encourage positive outcomes. Finally, sample size is a key challenge. That was raised earlier this morning, and I can't emphasize how important that is. Our N of 600 is probably relatively small for some of these questions, but again, I think we need ways to use studies like ours, and I think it also underscores the importance of studies like the National Children's Study. I know I've been also a little frustrated with the direction that the study has gone in, but I hope there's an opportunity there to still address many of these really key issues and key determinants of health in children. So that's the end of my talk. I want to thank our funders and thank our other collaborators on the study, particularly Brenda Eskenazi and Nina Holland and others. Kim Harley actually should be up here too. I don't have her picture here, but she's a very important part of our team. And then, of course, our participants. So thank you.